You may have probably noticed that in lessons 1.3 and 1.4, we did not do addition and subtractions with different denominators for more than two fractions. And the reason is, when we have more than two fractions with different denominators, the process gets a little bit more complicated. But we're not going to learn that yet. We're going to learn that in lesson 1.8. In lesson 1.7, we're going to learn a very important step we need before we can move on to actually doing addition and subtractions with more than two fractions with different denominators. This step is called the least common denominator. The least common denominator is a technique to find a common denominator when we have way too many fractions. And the process is the same every time. The first step that we need to do is find the prime factorization of all of the denominators, starting with the 3. The prime factorization of 3 is simply 1 times 3. Remember, prime factorization is finding all of the factors that are prime numbers. Now, let's do the 4. What are the prime factorization of 4 is 1 times 2 times 2, because 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 times 2 is 4, and all of them are prime numbers. And then we take care of the 8. So what is the prime factorization of 8? 1 times 2 is 2, times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. So first we take the prime factorization of all of our denominators. The next step is to, well, actually do the least common denominator. To find the least common denominator, we're going to make a combination of all of these numbers. But which numbers do we pick? Let's start with the easiest part. We don't really worry about the 1. We can erase it. We don't use the 1 for the least common denominator because everything is multiplication. And to be honest, when we multiply times 1, we never really write it. So now we see that there are a 3 and a bunch of 2's. So let's first focus on the 3 because the 3 is by itself. The 3, there is no repeated, there is no other 3. So we start with the numbers that do not have repetitions. This 3 is part of the least common denominator. Because it doesn't have any repetitions, we write it into our equation of the least common denominator. Now we need to focus on the 2's. There are 2 2's on the second line with the 4 and 3 2's on the third line with the 8. Which one do we pick? Well, we are always going to pick where we have the most of that number. In the top line we have 2, in the bottom line we have 3, so we don't consider the top line, we only consider the bottom line because it has the most 2's. And we write them into our least common denominator equation. Now this is our least common denominator. All we need to do is multiply. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. So the least common denominator of these 3 fractions is 24. But as usual, we know that sometimes we need a little bit more practice to fully understand the topic, so let's do it one more time. We need to find the prime factorization of all of these denominators, starting with 15. Which prime numbers multiply each other gives us 15? 1, 3, and 5. 1 times 3 is 3, 3 times 5 is 15, and they are all prime numbers. Now we need the prime factorization of 9. So 1 times 3 equals 9, and they are all prime numbers. And then the prime factorization of 6. 6 is 1 times 2 times 3. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 3 is 6. So we built our prime factorization. Now let's find our least common denominator. Remember the first step. Let's erase the 1. Actually, we don't even have to write it. We don't have to consider it. Okay? Because when we multiply times 1, we don't do any changes in any multiplication. Now let's focus on the numbers that do not have repetition. Starting with the 5, let's put it into our equation. And the other number that doesn't have repetition is the 2. So let's put it into the equation. The remaining are this bunch of 3's. We have 1 on the top, 2 in the middle, 1 on the bottom. Remember, we only really care about the place where we have the most. We only have 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom and 2 in the middle. So we disregard the 1 on the top and the 1 on the middle, and we take the 2 on the middle. Sorry, disregard the 1 on the top and the 1 on the bottom, and take the 2 on the middle. And we put them into our least common denominator equation. That's it. We took all of them. The 5 and the 2 because they had no repetition, and the 3 because 2 3s because we had the most 3s at the middle with 2 of them. After that is a multiplication. 5 times 2 times 3 times 3. We get that the least common denominator is 90. For more math lessons like this one, visit our website, mathusermanual.com, or follow us on Instagram at mathusermanual.